Does anyone remember 2013, specifically when this game released, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag? That happened on the 29th of October. Well, as it turns out, today is not that day, but look, October's going to be crammed with game releases and other games to throw back to, and I'm simply not going to have the time at that time to do it. But as it turns out, I've got very little to work with at the moment, so I thought I might jump the gun with this video's timing. A, to give myself something to do now, and B, to give myself something less to do later. Can I promise higher quality content this way? Honestly, no. But frankly, this is the only way this video's ever getting done, and I'd rather do it than not. You see, in my opinion, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag is one of the better Assassin's Creed games. Not that that's an especially high bar to clear, but you get the idea. But it's also one of the strangest in Ubisoft's pre-bastardize everything phase, slotting in as both a prequel and sequel to Assassin's Creed 3, with the present day being set after the present day of 3, and yet the historical period is about the grandfather of the protagonist of 3's historical segment, so in that respect it's a little bit weird. And there's more weirdness to Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, that's for certain. That weirdness enhanced the experience in some ways, harmed it in others, but for the most part, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag is a fantastic, charming game. In today's video, we're going to be exploring it 10 years after its release. Well, not quite, like I said, but you get the point. Because, honestly, I kinda fancied it, so please enjoy. So to begin with, let's talk story. It's a major talking point and there's a lot of things to talk about here, so this will give me an opportunity to get through some of my bigger talking points before you inevitably get bored and click off. We play as pirate Edward Kenway, who's in the Caribbean in search of riches and glory. He's not an assassin, but he kills one and decides that his clothes are his now. In fact, he's not an assassin for the vast majority of the game, if any of it. He just likes to dress up as one. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag was the first Assassin's Creed game in which you technically didn't play as an assassin in favour of a gimmick. In Black Flag, for the vast majority of the story, Edward is a pirate first and foremost. He may have assassin robes, he may have hidden blades, he may be able to carry out assassin acts, even if it is sometimes for the sake of gameplay convenience rather than for any deeper meaning, and 4 out of 5 missions may indeed be a tailing mission. Roughly 90% of Edward's story follows him as a pirate. He knocks about on his ship the Jackdaw and plunders other vessels, in search of the riches and glory that he craves as his driving factor. Based on the information I've just cherry-picked and fed to you, it doesn't sound too dissimilar to say how in Assassin's Creed Valhalla you play as a Viking first and foremost, or how in Assassin's Creed Odyssey you play as an eagle-bearing Greek mercenary, and those games bump off traditional Assassin's Creed elements in favour of gimmicks. Even if in Odyssey's case they wanted to do a game about ancient Greece, but that had to be set before the origin story that they just told, so they couldn't actually have assassins in it. In other words, they snookered themselves, scrubbing it of any meaningful brand identity and then didn't even bother to add a gimmick. So it can be quite easy by that logic to look at Black Flag as another example of an Assassin's Creed game that isn't really Assassin's Creed, but in my opinion, it's different. Even though I'm sure Ubisoft saw Black Flag as a prototype that proved that they could indeed take the Assassin's Creed brand and slap it on games that have absolutely nothing or little to do with actual assassins for the sake of selling those games faster than perhaps a new IP would be able to, I don't think testing the waters, forgive the pun, was the initial intent of the game. Because unlike later Assassin's Creed gimmick games, shall we say, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag keeps the assassin element close to the chest, it keeps it relevant, and the story works towards something to do with that, which just isn't the case with, say, Valhalla. And I don't just mean fan service for the sake of it, I mean genuinely meaningfully done things, even if Ubisoft then forgot that they actually needed to take that and go somewhere with it. You see, Edward's journey as a pirate gets caught up in the activities of both the Assassins and Templars, and his character development hinges on that massive complication of his life. He functions as a third party in this conflict, and as he becomes increasingly aware of the destruction he leaves in his wake in search of these riches, he realises that he's already accomplished his goal and it's had massive consequences for the people in his life. and now that he's opened his eyes to the genuine threat posed by the Templars, it's time to pick a side, and though not officially, he spiritually begins to become an actual assassin. So even though you don't play as an assassin directly, the assassin ideology is relevant, and Edward's story is on a collision course with that. It wasn't perfect, it could have done with more than just the one sequence fleshing out Edward embracing the ways of an assassin over the ways of a pirate, but of the Assassin's Creed games that tried to give us this outsider perspective, I'd argue that Black Flag is the only one that has the right to carry that title. As the outsider perspective, taking up the bulk of the game as a one-off experience isn't necessarily bad for a franchise trying to be as narratively complex as Assassin's Creed used to be. It's worth keeping in mind that now, at least to a surface level degree, it's no longer a one-off. I feel as if Black Flag has been devalued by that, and perhaps its saving grace is that Ubisoft doesn't appear to understand Assassin's Creed anymore. For example, outside of surface level interactions, Assassin's Creed Valhalla doesn't try to implement the assassins, or hidden ones shall I say, to an extent that has value and adds to the experience, or is integral to the narrative making sense. It's just a Viking game, and the Assassin Templar ideologies and conflict was an afterthought. In Black Flag, that simply wasn't the case. The assassin aspect to Assassin's Creed 4 is meaningful and has payoffs. It doesn't exist separately to the main story, it runs parallel, and the main protagonist has to come to understand it for it to take effect. It has greater meaning than giving us gameplay convenience, though it does its fair share of that too. The overarching themes of the brand bond coherently with the themes of this individual game. The pirate elements are a product of the game's setting, and the assassin aspects get slowly brought to the forefront over the course of the narrative and become increasingly relevant as a result. I could talk for hours about this point and how it sets itself apart from Valhalla, but I have a feeling that you want to exit this video with your will to live just as much as I want to exit making this video with mine. Retroactive positives aside, the story does boast other qualities. Edward Kenway is a compelling protagonist, and the narrative boasts other fascinating characters, including historical figures such as Blackbeard. There are others, but he is of course the iconic pirate. I am a sucker for good history, and Assassin's Creed and Black Flag certainly has it. But it's not a story about recounting historical events for the sake of it. Where they fit, the story includes them, but for the most part is telling its own narrative, which is important for Assassin's Creed. The vast majority of Black Flag's narrative shortcomings come in the actual mission design, but there'll be time to discuss that at length later. But the major one to discuss in this segment is of course the modern day. You see, I think it's fair to say that Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag arrived at a strange time for Assassin's Creed. Up until this point it was quite focused and intriguing, however, Assassin's Creed 3 sort of snookered it, killing off the main protagonist of the modern day that we'd been with since Assassin's Creed 1. Without Desmond's perspective, we don't find ourselves in the shoes of a new modern day actual protagonist, and by that I mean character, until Assassin's Creed Origins in 2017. So instead we get a first person modern day functioning as a player insert. The modern day tries to keep it interesting, and it tries to keep the wheels spinning of the overarching narrative, but without Desmond it certainly suffers from a complete lack of direction. There's a lot of context and lore to be picked up in this small modern day space, and it does have its fascinating moments, but it doesn't really contribute to progressing the story that we were familiar with up until Assassin's Creed 3. Assassin's Creed's modern day segments have never reached ideal levels, but this is the first time that I ever registered it as not being all that interesting after all. It's very far from the worst modern day segment the franchise has had now, but there was a time where this was seen as much more disappointing. Previous modern days had been context rich and complemented the historical bulk of the games. Playing as an anonymous Abstergo employee under the guise of making a video game just didn't have that effect. I can see why Assassin's Creed fans who jumped on the franchise later or even before sometimes aren't the biggest fan of the modern day, because the interesting shit fizzed out for this. It's not a mark against Black Flag specifically. Assassin's Creed has struggled with its direction ever since, and within itself it's not a massive deal in my opinion, but the story could have benefited from a more engaging modern day segment, because that would have helped put what's going on a bit more in context. But to summarise, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag has a compelling and well-written story, complete with a vibrant cast of fascinating characters, and it treats the franchise that it belongs to with reverence. And for the most part, that's also well executed. So without going into too much detail and creating a month-long video, so despite a stalled modern day segment, Black Flag's story had its memorable moments, and I remember it fondly. And with that said, let's move on to gameplay. I think Assassin's Creed 4's gameplay is best described as agreeable. Its gameplay doesn't stray too far from the Assassin's Creed that I used to love, however it is more animation based rather than relying too much on player input like previous Assassin's Creed games did, and that applies to both the parkour and the combat. So in other words, it's basically a more refined version of Assassin's Creed 3's gameplay, if that even says an awful lot. The combat is incredibly straightforward, there are only so many enemy archetypes, and you fight them in this animation based system where if you get one kill, you can start working up a chain of instant kills. It's heavily dependent on counter kills, or very swiftly taking your opponent off guard and then finishing them off. It's very fast-paced animation combat that isn't designed to pose much challenge once you get going. That doesn't mean at times it doesn't make you want to rip your hair out, as once you throw allies into the mix, the combat can become a real clusterfuck, where your allies will be breaking up your chains, no enemies will be attacking you, and so in other words, you just gotta hit an enemy over and over again until hopefully they'll die. So that doesn't necessarily add difficulty, but it does make it a little bit tedious on occasion. As for the enemy archetypes that you're likely to encounter, like I said, there aren't an awful lot of them, but they do require different strategies that are usually quite similar with slight variations to tackle. And as a result, doing so seldom becomes a problem or even a challenge. It does even out, with the animations at times feeling quite satisfying when the combat is working according to the script, but if you can avoid it, it's hardly a system that's going to have you yearning to come back for more. Because often you'll find yourself doing the same thing over and over again on different enemy archetypes because it works and it's fast. And there's limited room to experiment in combat. That being said, you can use different tools. And there are also double kill animations that are rare in open combat unless you know how to activate them. Which is a bit of a shame, as they're the most satisfying animations in the entire system. But with the right know-how, they can be triggered quite easily. You're just unlikely to stumble upon them by accident very often. For example, a double counter kill animation will usually require you to block several attacks from a group of 3 or more guards before the option even becomes available. And by that I mean 2 guards finally get the wise idea of attacking you both at the same time. You can also pick up and use weapons that you can't keep permanently in your arsenal, such as big axes, muskets, or even single swords on their own. Not that I necessarily understand why you can't just draw one sword if you so wish to do so. And you can also use secondary weaponry such as pistols and rope darts seamlessly in combat. And all in all, the system is certainly competent. It's not really massively challenging, it's not groundbreaking. Sometimes it can be a bit of a slog, and other times, when it's going well, it can be extremely satisfying. There's no knack to it, but it does certainly work for Assassin's Creed. Between that and boss fights with giant monsters, I know which one I prefer. Moving on to the parkour system, it's relatively straightforward. The idea of player agency isn't completely out the window. It does show itself in some situations more so than others, but for the most part, again, it's just an animation-based system that allows you to move from A to B, though the game does make the error of assuming that you're going to be doing something that you're not sometimes, and simply put, that's where the errors that cause you to die are most likely to come from. The best way to describe it is, for safety mode, you hold down on the right trigger and don't hold A on Xbox, for example, and this will allow you to parkour without the risk of plummeting to your death. However, if you hold the jump button as well, you're no longer in safety mode, which allows you to more openly sort of parkour, but usually the game doesn't anticipate you doing that. To say that it's on rails would be a bad description, but it's not as open to player input as Assassin's Creed 1 through Revelations was. It's more in line with 3 opting for sleeker animations. I'd say similarly to the combat, but Assassin's Creed Brotherhood and Revelations made the shift towards animation-based combat as well. It's not a bad system, but for the most part, you can't really improve how quickly you do something, you simply just do what the game allows you to. There are some moments where player input is acknowledged positively, and there are other moments where it just doesn't really understand what you're trying to do, and as a result, you wind up doing something completely different. And on rare occasions, the system will lock up completely, and you'll stand there vacant like a clam pit for a few seconds. That doesn't mean the parkour system isn't competent. It's a game, and like every game ever, it's going to have moments where the gameplay gets confused, and that's usually where you encounter bugs and glitches. And when you compare it to more recent Assassin's Creed titles, 4's parkour system looks like the Starship Enterprise. As for the stealth is good, it does the job. I don't have any real talking points about it, it does the trick rather well. The world spaces are also designed to accommodate it, and that works out because Black Flag uses it an awful lot. But now let's talk about what was this game's biggest selling point, the naval. In Assassin's Creed 3, the naval took up a small portion of the game as a minor feature that sometimes overlapped with the main story. It was a straightforward system that did the job in a linear setting. What Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag does is takes that system, improves upon it, and then applies it to an open world. Being a game set in the Caribbean during the Golden Age of Piracy, sailing between A and B is mandatory for the open world to work. So while the traditional Assassin's Creed elements are important for this being an Assassin's Creed game, the naval elements are equally important with this being a pirate game. The ship can be used to traverse the world space and can also be used to attack other ships or fortresses. The traversal alone is satisfying. You can sail along whilst your crew's blasting out sea shanties, and that's only ever hampered by restricted areas functioning as choke points to prevent you from progressing until you upgrade your ship to fight your way through. And of course, the naval combat is massive amounts of fun for a fair bit. There are different types of vessels that can be encountered in naval combat, ranging from simple gunboats to a massive man-of-war, and they range in difficulty depending on the type of vessel that it is and where in the world space that you encountered it. Some regions are harder than others, so upgrading the jackdaw is a must for progressing through the main story, as that takes you all over the Caribbean, and with your ship you're going to need to navigate some tricky waters, meaning you'll find yourself in your fair share of naval battles. You upgrade your ship through finding resources, which can happen by picking up resources that are found in debris on the waters, plundering other vessels, including hunters who are sent after you when your wanted level increases, or through ransacking plantations without your ship. And on top of that, you need money, so other interactions with the open world are also a must. And then you can upgrade aspects that increase the amount of damage the jackdaw does, and also increases the amount of damage the ship can take before you desynchronize. It's a straightforward system. The prerequisites for upgrading your vessel are never absurdly high, and if you know where to look, the resources are abundant. As a result, the mechanics make or break is whether or not you enjoy it. For the most part, the naval remains enjoyable, but there are points where the magic does begin to wear thin a bit, as after spending hours doing the same thing over and over again, there are points where the naval does get a touch repetitive. And though once you've maxed out your ship, there are legendary ships in each corner of the map that pose a challenge to be tackled late into the game, I always find that I get fed up with sailing around and sinking ships well before then. So as we get towards the business end of the game, the novelty of being a pirate has completely worn off for me, and I actually begin to see how much the naval artificially inflates the game's length. Not that that's always entirely a bad thing. Being a pirate entails an awful lot of plundering. The game just enjoys putting naval obstacles between you and your next main story mission sometimes, and when that's enjoyable you barely notice. However, when the chunk of time taken up by this becomes disproportionately large compared to the rest of the game, that's when it does become an issue, and that's the case with grinding in, say, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. But fortunately, Black Flag doesn't take it that far. But this was the first Assassin's Creed game where I saw leveling as a potential obstacle. It just happened to be focused on the ship. The repetition is only something I notice in Assassin's Creed 4 when approaching the back end of the story, but I came out of my first playthrough of Assassin's Creed 4 hoping to never see naval in Assassin's Creed again. I didn't hate it back in 2013 or even now, but I really failed to see how this experience could be any further enhanced in a game that simply should have, at the very least, very different focuses. This thought process felt vindicated with the releases of Assassin's Creed Rogue, Assassin's Creed Origins and Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Not so much Valhalla, but all those games also had a naval element, but none of them added anything of significant value to the experience here, at least in my opinion. Anyway, moving on from the naval, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag's greatest weakness, and I mean that above all else, comes in its actual mission design. Assassin's Creed had always been mocked relentlessly for the amount of tailing missions that it had, but Black Flag takes that and makes it 80% of the game. That might be a slight exaggeration, to be fair, but the amount of tailing missions in this game is truly painful. And whoever it was that came up with ship tailing missions is a menace to society and needs to be stopped. There's nothing wrong with tailing or this game's take on eavesdropping, but is just tailing within a short range so you can overhear the conversation. But what I've always found to be frustrating about Assassin's Creed 4 is it uses tailing to the extent where it's no longer an interesting gameplay element. It feels like filler because very often very little of substance is gained. The gameplay of Assassin's Creed 4 is incredibly repetitive, especially because of the tailing missions, and I'd argue it's the number one thing that damages the quality of the experience. I'm sure there's a fair share of stealthily following people in an assassin's day-to-day life, and a healthy dose of tailing and tailing eavesdropping hybrid missions would have been perfectly fine. But there's simply so much more that you can do with an assassin and a pirate that tailing missions taking up this much of the actual main story gameplay and some of the side contents gameplay just felt cheap and frankly still does. And I'm not struggling to find tailing footage in like 300 recordings here. It's just tailing objective after tailing objective. You can't not have the occasional tailing objective in an Assassin's Creed game, in my opinion. These stealth segments typically help provide context about targets and things like that. But if you're tailing a ship, for example, you're not going to be able to hear that, so what's the actual point? Maybe do it once as a concept, but over and over again is when things start taking the piss. The problem I have with it in Black Flag is the extent of its implementation actually significantly reduces the gameplay variety, especially in the game's main story. Of all the things that assassins can be doing, and all the things that pirates can be doing, why are we always doing this? There are some tailing missions in this game that aren't terrible, but they are completely outnumbered by the ones that kind of are. But Black Flag's mission design is at its strongest when you aren't following things all of the time. That being said, the stealth in this game is functional, even if only barely in the ship segments, so they aren't necessarily massively challenging, which allows you to move on to the next tailing segment. So to conclude, Black Flag's gameplay was competent, but perhaps a little expired. So in that sense it's agreeable, but it was hardly mind-blowing. No open world game is complete without an open world, and fortunately Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag doesn't do too bad in this respect. The Golden Age of Piracy in the Caribbean is a fantastic setting, not just for an Assassin's Creed game, but for a video game in general. There's simply so much that can be done with an open space like this. Obviously, exploration and plundering are at the forefront of this, but Assassin's Creed 4 also boasts a massive range of side content. Some of it is quite interesting, other parts not so much. There are so many pointless collectibles in this game, so while there are positives, there are also drawbacks to discuss when talking about this open world. For a positive, there is plenty of stuff that appears to be pointless at a surface level, but it actually does have a reward down the line. There are some collectibles that just don't, like the Animus fragments. You collect those for seemingly no reason whatsoever. You can also kick the teeth in on some chests to collect riches, collect music sheets which unlock sea shanties for your crew to sing whilst you sail around the open world, and there are some other secrets in there as well, but you get the idea. There are a lot of collectibles. Fortunately, every location has a to-do list that will let you know when you've sapped that location of everything worth doing. Carrying out some assassination contracts is good fun, and is a good way to earn some decent money, paying out a bonus if you manage to stay out of combat. And then there are Templar hunts, which are mini assassin stories that you can choose to do or choose not to do. I didn't do too many of these because usually they're chock full of tailing missions, and as you can imagine, that's already done my head in this time. But doing all of them does yield some rewards. You can also hunt animals, which allows you to upgrade certain aspects to Edward's weapons and armour, giving him greater defences or more pistols. You get the idea. Standard hunting system. There are also open world activities that you can do whilst on the jackdaw. For example, you can go hunting whales and sharks. At certain points you can also dive to the bottom of the ocean with the diving bell and explore that environment, which is just a clever way of adding literal depth to the open world space, and it's definitely one worth exploring. You can also take on naval contracts, which effectively function as assassination contracts but for the sea. And then there's also besieging forts, which can also be great fun, if even only for a few minutes. One of the simple things that I've always enjoyed doing in Assassin's Creed 4 is finding abandoned ships at sea, that or the crew's entirely dead. Aboard you can find crates full of materials that may be useful to you, and you only have so much time before the ship sinks to actually gather as much as possible. Though if you're caught on board when the timer reaches 0, you will immediately desynchronize. I think it's a cool feature. There's a lot of content in Assassin's Creed 4's open world, not all of it is necessarily worthy of doing to 100% completion, but there's enough to immerse yourself in this world space. It's not a perfect open world full of side content, it could definitely do with more experiences over things that you gain by collecting collectibles or by participating in minor activities. But again, as far as Assassin's Creed is concerned, it's agreeable, it's serviceable, and of course on top of that you've got the atmosphere of the Caribbean, which is just fantastic. The vibrant colours of the tropical climate contrast the greys of Assassin's Creed 3. And of course there's a variety in the locations, from the seclusion of the sea to smaller islands, little towns, jungles, and of course big cities. And all that exploration is capped by a fantastic soundtrack, which for the sake of being cautious with copyright I've had to avoid using, my apologies. But the game certainly doesn't lack for atmosphere. I'd say its greatest setback as an open world has to do with its navigation when on land. For example, if two locations on opposite sides of an island exist, you can't get between them via land, you have to hop on your ship and go around, which makes sense as a quicker option, but what if you want to explore in between points? What if there's something that could have been there that just isn't? Assassin's Creed 4 certainly doesn't lack for its jungle environments. They could have placed something really exploration rich there that played into the sense of exploration that this game kind of feels built on. There are probably reasons why it wasn't a thing back in 2013, such as technical limitations, but a year later Assassin's Creed Rogue did this in some areas by giving you points where you can pass by land from one location to another. It didn't add very much interesting, but it was one of the few things that I could appreciate about Rogue. But I won't hold it too heavily against Black Flag, because there's no point, it's 10 years old, and I still enjoy this game. To conclude, I loved Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag back in 2013. I remember being at my grandmother's house, and the very moment the postman popped it through the letterbox in the door. Over the days that followed, I played it non-stop and loved it. Replaying it for this video, though I'm much more critical these days, I still understand why I did love it, and to some extent I still do. Though it has some hefty flaws such as copious amounts of tailing missions, I find it to be a massively enjoyable game. It has an excellent character-driven main story, when you cut out the tailing missions, and I find it to be both a decent pirate game and also a decent Assassin's Creed game. I both understand and don't understand when people say it's a great game, just not a great Assassin's Creed game, which has been thrown about since 2013, because this game stays Assassin's Creed relevant whilst exploring the historical period with you playing as a pirate for the most part. It's on a collision course, and that's kind of the point. To be fair, it has been devalued since with the releases of other games in which you don't play as an assassin, but in those games it's not working up towards anything, there's no coherence, it's just two separate things existing in the universe at the same time that cross over sometimes loosely and then never again. I find Assassin's Creed 4 to do this in a more controlled manner where there is a point and there is a connection, and the story is those things coming together. And for me, that's the better outsider perspective than whatever Valhalla was. The modern day may lack for focus in wake of Desmond's passing and that being an absolute mess, but the historical stuff, the writing there is on point pretty much all the time. It's the story of a self-interested pirate searching for glory and riches, coming to see a higher calling with the assassins, and then doing things for the greater good. So I find it to be decent as an Assassin's Creed game, but also enjoyable as a pirate game. It's never been without its flaws, and that can be said for every single Assassin's Creed title ever released in the history of the universe, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is, to this day, nearly 10 years later, like I said, we're not quite there yet, I still enjoy this game immensely. Its gameplay, though it can sometimes be exhausting, can also be exciting, and though its open world can sometimes be more lifeless than I would like, it's also vibrant and atmospheric and perfect for this kind of game. And though the standards aren't high, at least not anymore, I still regard this as one of the better Assassin's Creed games going. Thank you for watching. I'll see you soon.